Okay, I think, the last thing that we saw had to do with a child who causes damage. And we know that as a general halacha, children who cause damage cannot be held liable, nor can their parents be held liable. That's the general rule. But as many of you pointed out, let's say a school can create a policy that if your child causes damage in the school, they will be held liable. The other question that we discussed is when a person causes damage as a child, do they have a liability once they become an adult? And the ruling that the poskim and Rav Shiraga said quite explicitly is that no, me'ikr hadin, he's not going to be liable, but al pi Kabbalah and lifnim mishuras hadin midas chasidus, he does have to do tshuva for sins that he committed when he was a youngster. Okay, so I think what we're going to do is we're going to start the next tshuva. Okay, sugim shonim shel iser hazakriya. Okay, different kinds of visual damage. Now, what do we mean by visual damage? We know that the Gemara in Bava Basra talks about this extensively, that I'm not allowed to create a structure that will either obstruct your view or deprive you of your privacy. Okay, so let's say, for example, I have a bay window that faces your property, but there's a wall that divides so that it provides me with privacy. You're not allowed to start, making changes to that or building your structure higher or building a window opposite mine or in any other respect to be able to deprive me of that privacy. So the question that he's going to be asking over here is, Hamazik es chavero behezek re'iyah. If a person causes damage to someone through vision, ha'im chayev b'tashlumin, does he have to compensate him? So first of all, he says, Hine yesh lahakdim de pashut sha'asr la'adam lahazik mamon chavero o ligram lo nezek. So obviously we know that you're not allowed to cause damage to a person's property or to even cause that person's property to be damaged. V'yesh bazek kama lavin. And there are many prohibitions that are contained in the Torah. Reishis kol nira diyesh bazem mishum iser gezel. First of all, by causing someone damage, you're stealing from them. Uchamosha kasav hatur, the kamosha asur la'adam ligzal maman chavero, kach asur lahazik maman chavero. Just like I'm not allowed to steal money from you, I'm not allowed to damage your property, which results in the same thing, that you're out-of-pocket loss. Zos va'od sha'over al-iser bal tashchis. Furthermore, if I damage, let's say I just wantonly take a crowbar and break someone's window, I've been over on bal tashchis. Va'afilu mamono, just wantonly destroying things. Va'afilu mamono asur lahashchis v'chol shekein mamon acherim. I'm not allowed to destroy my own money, my own finances, and certainly I cannot do that with others. There's a positive commandment of love your fellow as yourself. So we also know that the Torah says you have to return someone's lost items, which means that the Torah says be concerned about preserving the property of your fellow. Then certainly you're not allowed to damage his property. And this is true even if your objective is to pay him back afterwards. So I don't know why this whole introduction was necessary, because it's all fairly obvious, right? We all understand that. Uvenogeya lehezek re'iyah. So when it comes to visual damage, yeshnam shnei sugei hezek. There are two types. Yeshno hezek shahari'iyah ba'atzma po'eles hezek. Sometimes seeing something causes the damage. Uchamosha haGemara omeret, asur lo la'adam lamod al sdei chavero b'sha'a she'omedet b'kamoteha. That a person is not allowed to stand and watch out over his friend's field while it is laden with fresh crops. So a guy's got a cornfield or a wheat field. You shouldn't just be standing out there looking out at his stalks. Why? Kevin shemazik oso ba'ayin ra'a sheroa shahasada malaya tavua uchedoma. Because of the principle of ayin ra'a or ayin hara. And that's actually paskind in Shulchan Aruch. This whole concept of ayin hara, that by looking with either jealousy or contempt at the assets of your friend, you're causing some kind of damage. Uvesefer chasidim mashma shehamazik ba'ayin hara yesh bo mishum iser gazel. And if you do end up visually, looking out at someone's property and causing them damage, you've done an act of theft. Now, the Makor Baruch on this says, Amnom ayin barambam shekasav shebegina tzarich livnos kosel asar tfachim v'lo tzarich dalet amos. But he says it is curious that the Rambam does not require you to build a wall around your field. He says if you have a field that is not out in farmland, but rather is, let's say, in an urban area, you only have to build a fence of 10 tfachim. You don't have to build a wall that will block vision. Ubir sham harav hamagid shadas harambam dumasha amru asur la'adam lamad al sdei chaver b'shasham anis bekamoseha ena ela mibidas chasidus ayin sham. Because the Rambam, as we all know, was a rationalist. The Rambam did not believe in superstition. And so his statement, he interprets the Gemara's statement that you're not allowed to stand next to your friend's field and look out at it because it could cause damage. He says that's not strict halacha. That's just piety, and it's not necessary. The Gemara, when it says it, is not, when it says usr, it doesn't really mean usr. It's just saying that it's improper to do that. V'chein kasav harambam gufei b'tshuva l'chachmei lunil k'mo shehevi sham hamigdal oz ayin sham. And the Rambam actually wrote this explicitly to the wise men of Lunil, and this was part of the reason why the Rambam came under scrutiny, is because he took liberties sometimes with Gemaras that talked about superstitious practices, and he said that this is not real. V'chein kasav habeis Yosef b'shem harav hamagid, v'chein sas amaran b'shulchan aruch sham kedas harambam, v'yitachen shegam hasefer chasidim shekasav sheyesh bazem mishum gezel, hainu mimidas chasidus. And it could be also the Sefer Chasidim when he says it's an act of theft. If you cause damage through your ayin hara, it's not actionable, but it's speaking to people who wish to be pious. Va'od ayin bekilas Yankov shehevi b'shem chacham echad shim echad hizik lechaver al yidei ayin hara yiyapatur l'shalim. And furthermore, I think he's referring to the Stipler. He says that if a person causes damage to his friend through his ayin hara, then he's pater. Dirak amru chazal she'asr lamod liyad hasada b'shasham anis b'kamoseha avalo kasvu shechayv l'shalim im hizik. The rabbis just said, don't give a person an ayin hara, but if you do, that's not actionable. You can't, first of all, how are you going to prove it, right? Right? Vakilas Yankiv sham kasav di'yitachen de be'emes hu chayv l'shalim. But the Kilas Yaakov argues that it could be that you are chayiv to pay. And the only reason why the rabbis can't hold you liable is because they can't prove that it was you. But if it could be traced back to one person, if, let's say, a Navi came along and said, yes, your ayin hara caused this damage, then you would be liable to pay. Omnam nira shelafi divrei harambam ve'shulchan aruch shehiveinu le'el dahabi rak midas chasidus mistaber shelaolam yiyah poter demikar hadin ein iser klal lihistakel. But that doesn't seem to be the case from the Rambam. The Rambam would be of the opinion that there's really no such thing as hezek re'iyah, and this whole thing about ayin hara is not something that he's concerned about. Now, so I want us all to be clear that the whole concept of ayin hara is debated among the medievalists. The Rambam did not believe in it. But that's the first kind of hezek re'iyah, of visual damage.
So if you verbalized it, if you kind of said, why should that person get that? They don't need to do it.
Right.
And there could be evidence for what you.
There's evidence for what you believe, but there's no evidence that your feelings caused the damage.
Right.
So if you put that into today's environment, if you stopped and looked at somebody's house, just like that, or you want, I mean,
if you're admiring the architecture,
right. Does that fall under this?
It depends. It could be. First of all, sometimes people build unusually picturesque houses because they want you to stop and look at it, right? Which may not be a wise thing to do if you believe in ayin hara.
The Stonehill Gardens is say, I can't remember what the sign says about, this is a best garden.
Right.
Thornhill,
Yeah.
So they want you to stop and look and admire. But is admiration the problem, or is it jealousy or
Well, no,
desire?
the concern is that the admiration is causing the
I think there's a fine line between admiration and jealousy.
Right.
They could spill over one into the other. I mean, all I know is that when I walk by those gardens, I do think, wow, that's really pretty. I wish I had the time, or I wish, even if I had the time, I don't think I would. I'd probably do something else.
Right.
But is it to protect ourselves, or we're concerned about hurting the owner?
It's concerned. You were concerned about harming the owner.
We're not doing any harm to ourselves?
We probably are, but that's not the issue that we're concerned about when we learn Choshen Mishpat. Now, as any time we do something that's harmful to others, we're always going to harm ourselves in the process, right? Because you're, you fill yourself with evil or whatever you want to call it, right? But in Choshen Mishpat halacha, the concern is what you're doing to the other person. The yesh od sug hezek re'iyah, shehu midin nizkei shchenim. So that's the first type of damage through vision. There's another type of damage through vision, which has to do with laws of neighbors. Shal yedei re'iyaso hu monea mechavero sheyuchal lihishtamesh b'chatzer o b'mirpeset, that through your vision, you prevent your neighbor from using his courtyard or his balcony bidvarim shehu lo me'unyan shiroto, in such a way where by his knowing that you have visibility to his property, he's going to refrain from doing certain activities. I have a pool, and the women in my house may want to swim, but now that you've built this balcony overlooking my backyard, I feel the women in my family feel uncomfortable going outside in their bathing suits and swimming. Va'al kagon ze nemar ayman de be'oy limihavi chasida yekayim mili de nezikim. That's why the rabbis say that if you want to be pious, you should study the laws of nezikin so that you'll know what to do and what not to do. And that's a more, let's say, prosaic reason why you're not allowed to look out into your neighbor's property, because you're preventing him from doing certain activities that he would normally want to do. And doesn't just have to do
a good thing.
Right. What do you mean it could be a good thing? What if
There's
he's
something wrong?
if he's burying bodies?
Yeah. Getting an even tan or something. You shouldn't be doing it outside.
He's working for the cartel, manufacturing crystal meth in his backyard. Okay. V'chein tzarech lihizaher milihit akev neged pesach chaver o chatzera. And therefore, it's also prohibited to tarry, to stand by, let's say, your friend's doorway. Let's say the front door is open. So, sometimes you have these looky-loos who, what's going on?
It's not.
Or looky-loos, you never heard that phrase before?
That was the American,
Yeah, that's.
I guess we use the Christian peeping Tom, I think peeping Tom, right?
Yeah, that's an American. It must be an American thing. It never made it up to Canada. Okay. Okay. Oh,
That's not
Chatzer.
bad.
Yeah. Yesh lihizaher afilu me're'iyah kala. You'll have to Google it. All right. And then you should also be careful, even from a casual glance. Kevin shal yedei re'iyah zu hu magbil es chavero milihishtamesh bevesu v'chatzero kafir someone, because you're inhibiting your neighbor from using his property in the way that he would like. So I guess, I'm just thinking in my own backyard, I have neighbors. If I wanted to, I could go up to the fence and look through the shrubs and see them socializing in the summer with their friends. So he says, you're not supposed to be doing that. That's you're not supposed to be looking out at things that your neighbors are doing, because especially if they're aware of that, they're going to become self-conscious and not want to use their property. Similarly, there's damage through hearing. That you have to avoid trying to listen in to what your neighbor is speaking about in his home or in his courtyard. The kol shegen shiganai hadavar lamod acharei hachalonos shel chavero v'lishmoa ma shehem medabrim, and certainly to stand by the window or the door of someone else to try and eavesdrop on what they are talking about. Okay, so all of these things are halacha. Okay, to either overlook what someone is doing when you know that it's private, or to eavesdrop on someone else's conversation.
What's the punishment for that?
So there is no specific punishment, but in other words, it's not that we can say that we assess you for that. He also, in the footnote, says, Ki yadua yesh cherem shel Rabbeinu Gershom al mi shekore igeret shel chaver lelo rishus. We know that one of the takanas that Rabbeinu Gershom had made is to read someone else's mail without their permission. Ve'al pi zeh kosav b'sefer Mishpatei HaTorah shegam ha'azanos seser bichlal ha'cherem. So the Sefer Mishpatei HaTorah writes that included in that prohibition is listening stealthily to what someone else is doing. He says, because the reason why you're not allowed to read a letter that's one person corresponded to another is because it's private. It's a private communication. The same argument applies to listening in on a private conversation between two people. Oh, is that right? Oh, I see what you're saying.
One wife.
So that's a lot harder today with people with cell phones and talking about they're having a private conversation. You can't help but if they're on the bus.
Well, that's their problem.
Yeah,
But isn't
right.
their problem?
Yeah, but
Well-
if you're sitting with someone on the bus and they're yapping away, how are you supposed to, plug
Yeah.
your ears?
Right. If a person is having a private conversation in a public venue, then that's
It's not
not
a private conversation.
right. This is where they're having a private conversation in their home, but their window happens to be open and they may not be aware that you are within earshot. He says there are some people who write the following letters. Hagin, Pei Gimel Yud Nun, which stands for Uporetz Geder Yishachenu Nachash, that he who breaks down any breaches shall be bitten by a snake. Okay, in other words,
Which is cursed.
that's right. Yeah, it's almost like a witch's curse, but it's actually a statement by Chazal that you're not allowed to be poretz getter. Poretz getter usually can apply not just to invading someone's privacy, but it also refers to, let's say, a community has a certain standard, and you go ahead and say, well, I'm going to do something that's lower than the community standards as far as religious observance. I'm not violating halacha, but I'm violating the community standards. So then that's also called a poretz getter. Okay? Im yesh bo mamish. Does that have any significance if a person writes that on the top of his letter? Shuva. So he says, is those letters are meaningless because even without writing those letters, he says, you're not supposed to read someone else's mail. Umali lo telech rachil la'acherim, ola atzmo ad kan lashona. And what difference does it make if you tattletale to others or if you just inquire information on your own? So that's what he's adding, the Rav Chagiz, who was a Sephardi. He's saying that it's not just a takan of Rabbeinu Gershom, it's Rabbeinu Gershom was just clarifying something that's already usher from the Torah. The Shayach b'chol gilui starav shalacherim. So revealing or discovering someone else's private information is usher. Nimtza lefi devarav tiyesh bahazano seiser iser deoraisa shalo seilech rachel. And it seems like from what he's saying is to try to discover private information about someone else is a biblical prohibition of lo telech rachil, do not be a talebearer. Because being a talebearer doesn't just mean providing others with secret information or gossip, but it also means finding out yourself secret information about someone else. Okay, so we've seen that you can cause damage through vision by invading someone's private space with your vision, or invading someone's private space through your eavesdropping. He says, yes, it's true that no mortal court can hold you liable, but there may be heavenly liability. And that's something that could mean that if you don't try to pacify your friend by offering him compensation for the damage that you've caused by your snooping around, then you could, they'll hold you liable in Shemayim. And the Makor Baruch quotes the Aruch HaShulchan, who says, "V'chein aser lahazik b'ri'iyaso," you're not allowed to damage through your vision. V'chayiv b'dinei Shemayim im hizik ba'ayin mabato lechavera. And if you do cause damage through your, let's say, your ayin hara, or by inhibiting your friend's use of his property, then you're going to be chayiv b'dinei shamayim. The kachamru Chazal, and so did our sages say, asr la'adam lamod al stei chaveru b'sha'a she'omedet b'kamoteha. You're not allowed to stand by your friend's field when it's laden with fresh produce. V'chein kol minei hezek re'iyah asr kamo lihistakel b'ma she'chaveru osa b'vesu v'chatzero. And similarly, you're not allowed to look into what your friend is doing on his private property, in his home and in his courtyard. So, so you ask the question, Doug, what about a person who's yapping away on their cell phone in public? So there is, when you talk about liability of the person who's looking or listening versus the person who's doing his activity, it seems that there's greater liability that is implicated for the listener or the looker than for the person who's doing the activity. Could there be an argument, well, you shouldn't have been doing it in your backyard if it was really private? Yes and no. If it's an activity that a person is entitled to expect privacy from his neighbors when he's doing it in his backyard. So, for example, he's luxuriating on his lawn furniture, and he's having a conversation with friends, and he's having, let's say, a barbecue, and they're enjoying life, maybe even around the pool. So then that's something that the standards of the community demand that everyone should be entitled to privacy. And you should respect that privacy, because you would want that privacy also in that kind of situation.
Right, in secular law, there's the privacy stuff that applies, in breach of privacy, reasonable expectation of privacy or not. And then some of these other things with REIA or, ogling or whatever it is, could be a private nuisance in the law of nuisance, where you are unreasonably interfering with someone's use or enjoyment of their own property in a, improper way. So that could be actionable with damages also for that. And also the peering at women swimming and stuff, that also could be a criminal offense of leering or whatever it is, if you're doing that. There was a case a couple of years ago in the pool at Osgood, or at what do you call it, the university up here, York, where a professor, swam every day with goggles and kept staring at all the women swimming. And they found that he was ogling them, right? And the women felt very uncomfortable. They found that was a breach of the code of conduct. And it was also, I think they found it was a sexual harassment under the Human Rights Code. And they're even thinking of charging him criminally for leering or whatever the criminal charge is.
What happened?
I don't know. I just heard.
Well, that again that's a very subjective thing, right? Like if I was that professor, just because I'm wearing goggles in the pool doesn't mean that my intention is to look at women's legs
He
while
was
I'm
hanging out in the shallow end under the water, watching them all swimming back and forth.
Wasn't quite.
There's more details here.
Yeah, there's a,
Wasn't like he
question
was
of
swimming-
degree, right? It wasn't just.
Yeah, he wasn't swimming links watching,
He was hanging out watching them for a long time. Anyway, that's sort of.
interesting.
Bad breed, yeah.
I guess it comes to a point where if you create a discomfort or an inhibition, then that could be a potential issue. But when you hear a case like that, you understand why in Jewish law we would require separate hours for men and women for swimming, right?
You also have scenarios where when you talk about seeing damages, that when you do renovations in a place, like I know this in Israel, it is so common. If you build something and like the neighbor over there, their view is a little bit now, their view is a little bit obstructed, but you
Right.
have complete legitimacy to do that. I know my kids put a bike rack in front of their place, and three of the neighbors were walking in going, that's what you're taking, like, what are you talking about? It's on their property, like, they get cuckoo. And
Yeah. No.
so I don't know where you draw the line, because it was nothing wrong what they did by putting a little bike rack in front of their front door in these townhouse complex, and people are cuckoo.
Well, I mean, you have that here also with what is it, homeowners associations.
There's laws about that.
Yeah.
In Florida, apparently, they're very much like that. All these laws about each, in these communities about.
So the communities have their own halachas, so you
Yeah,
can't do this,
yeah.
but this is on a regular street, on an open area. And they did a renovation, they put like a little hut over their washer and dryer on the third floor outside, and the neighbor was like 20 meters away like this, and like, it wasn't like our whole view of the whole Yerushalayim is
Ruined, yeah.
like, so where do you, how do you
Yeah.
draw the line halachically? So legally, there was nothing wrong that they did. But you're not talking about city laws here, you're talking about halacha. So there was an older couple, like there's so many scenarios that come up. And people
Right,
Law of
which,
feedback.
I guess that's the reason why most of this stuff is not actionable, because so much of it is potentially subjective. But a person could be held liable b'dinei shamayim if the majority of people, when looking at that scenario, would say, yeah, that you've created a bad view for that person. Like, let's say a person has beachfront property and with a beautiful view. That there are laws that are that would prevent another building to go up in front of him to block his property.
Right, that's public nuisance. That's
right.
nuisance. That's unreasonable interference with many people's views, or, if you block out the sun, now we get shade and it's cold, like whatever. or an objectionable, a billboard or, yeah,
Yeah.
stuff like that.
I know when we're looking at developing our property and putting up you know, a condo building, and you have to do shade studies, right?
It's not
Right.
shaded.
Right, right.
The
Okay.
Rumba wouldn't believe it, so don't worry about it.
In New Zealand, before you do anything to the property, you have to get consent from all neighbors around you that they agree with your plans.
Well, that's
Yeah.
why you have to have permits.
Right, well, yeah, but some people do it without, but in New Zealand, it's fine. If you don't get the okay, they can force you to take the construction down.
Mhm.
When we, Edward and I were in Erie, I mean,